告诉大家，民主国家是一个可怕的观念，但你也不要因为我们在讨论以色列，觉得所有的以色列人都是如此的好战，都是屠杀者。以色列也有反战者，例如有2个良心犯，为什么成为政治犯呢？因为他们拒绝服役去加萨，他们认为这是一个不人道的，是一个屠杀性的行为，所以就被抓起来关。获释之后，他还是不去，他还要再坐牢，他准备一直坐牢，一直坐牢。他只有18岁，这是以色列的反战人士。虽然目前为止我们得到的消息只有2个，以色列人们知不知道世界发生了什么事情呢？根据英国的 Channel 4所观察的报道，以色列当地电视台根本就跟中央电视台大陆的央视完全一样，几乎全面只报道以色列的人质的问题，以色列的军队的问题，偶尔有一些画面像加萨的建筑物以及居民们需要一些食物，但是几乎都没有加萨真正的报道。对于国际对于以色列的批评更是只字未提。以色列人真的活在民主国家吗？
Outside the gates of an Israeli military prison, 2 proud parents wait for their daughter to be released. 18-year-old Sophia has just finished a 20-day jail term. Her crime? She's one of only 2 conscientious objectors since the war in Gaza began, refusing Israel's compulsory military service.
Yeah, maybe go to the shade.
Yeah.
I'm very hot.
How do you feel? Was it worth it?
Yes. Short answer, yes. Yes. Long answer is that it's hard. It's important for me personally to make that stand and to resist the notion that all soldiers are heroes and they are protecting the country instead of continuing a cycle of violence.
Right now, with the atmosphere around the war in Gaza, you're a tiny, tiny minority.
I've gotten called in prison, straight up face-to-face, a traitor. And I think that most of the country thinks of me as a traitor because people split it into us versus them, and I don't see it that way at all. I don't see any us and them here.
But very few Israelis see the conflict the way Sophia does. Tel Aviv is just 50 miles up the coast from northern Gaza, but you wouldn't know there's a war raging nearby. Posters calling for the release of Israeli hostages still held by Hamas, a reminder of the trauma of the October 7th attacks. The enormity of the daily trauma suffered by Palestinians in Gaza as a result of Israel's assault simply isn't seen by most people in Israel.
We've been looking at coverage of the war on Israeli TV and have analysed last week's main evening news bulletins on all the most popular channels. Over the course of the 5 days that we examined, there was not a single clip of a Palestinian in Gaza describing what they're going through. Only at times images of people rushing towards aid or of destruction. There is plenty of coverage of the war, but barring a few exceptions, it's all through the lens of Israeli soldiers or the families of hostages.
也就是说，在以色列电视上，你看不到加萨的孩子挖草当饭吃。
ايش بتعملوا؟
بنلقط الحشيش عشان نطبخ.
نعم؟
بنلقط الحشيش عشان نطبخ.
也看不到骨瘦如柴的加萨孩子们，就算看到了又怎么样？仇恨已经蒙蔽了大多数以色列人的眼睛。
Some newspapers do take a more critical stance, but their readership is comparatively much smaller.
Can it be realistic that people don't have an idea of what's really going on? Or
it is realistic because, people live in the comfort zone of denial and they don't want to know anything that might affect their predispositions. The Israeli public is getting from the Israeli media a very government-oriented, military-oriented picture.
Why is that?
Because of that devastation and that humiliation and that anger that October 7th evoked.
Would it be fair to say that even now there's a a large section of the population that views the entirety of Gaza as complicit with October the 7th.
Sure, you get that all the time. You get to ask the guy who's crossing the street right now, he'll tell you they're all the same. 2.5 million Palestinians in Gaza, they're all Hamas, which is not true, but that's the sentiment.
因此，所有对加萨行动的批评，哪怕说是事实，都会被扣上反犹的大帽子。
A lot of right-wing people perceive us to be like terrorists, like Hamas, like we're against Israel. Which is ridiculous because if I say that the Palestinians have rights, it doesn't mean that I'm against Israelis. I just believe every human being has rights.
最新的民族罪人是刚以《梦想集中营》拿下奥斯卡最佳国际影片奖的犹太裔导演葛拉瑟。他在奥斯卡得奖感言中发表了批评以色列加萨行动的言论，遭到上千名犹太电影专业人士的联名谴责。巧合的是，这一部在2021年开拍的电影，内容是奥斯威辛集中营最高指挥官带着全家人住在集中营隔壁的庄园里，集中营与他家美丽的花园仅一墙之隔。
Das hier ist die Mauer vom Lager. Ja, das ist die Lagermauer. Also da haben wir auch noch Wein gepflanzt, damit das zuwächst, damit man das nicht mehr so sieht.
即便屠杀惨案天天在花园围墙的另一头发生，他们在墙的这一头却依然每天过着美好的生活。现在看来是多么的讽刺。看到这里，你或许会问：不是有很多以色列人上街抗议，要求纳坦雅胡下台吗？现实是，他们诉求是要求政府立刻达成协议，让人质回家，与加萨没有太大关系。这正是以色列主流意识。以色列电视台3月13日最新民调显示，如果今天举行选举，甘茨领导政党将在议会中赢得34个席次，而纳坦雅胡仅能拿下17席。然而，这仅仅反映出人们对纳坦雅胡渐渐失去耐性，而不是反对剿灭哈马斯行动。
In terms of the mainstream protests we're seeing on the streets, they really revolve around either Israeli suffering or internal dynamics, not what people are protesting about in Britain or Europe.
100%. In fact, the moment people start talking about genocide and war crimes, people circle the wagons. People feel that, okay, this is too much. And then they start, this is anti-Semitism, and they've always been anti-Israeli, and they don't understand the reality.
Back with Sophia, she's preparing for another stint in jail. She'll keep being sent to prison until either she or the army relents.
What do you think explains the disconnect between how you're seeing what's happening in Gaza, how much of the world is seeing what's happening in Gaza, and how most of the rest of Israeli society is seeing it?
In Israel in general, there's a very, very strong notion of dehumanization of the Palestinians. And while the rest of the world sees thousands of people getting killed and injured and displaced in Gaza, the people in Israel, a lot of them just see the enemy. When you have such strong racism being told to you as the correct narrative from a very, very young age, it's really hard to break through that.
In Israel, the prevailing view is that Hamas and its brutal rampage is responsible for all the bloodshed. The choking rage and existential fear of the early days of the war has begun to fade, but the anger and trauma of October the 7th is now ingrained in this nation's psyche and overrides anything else.